Kingston and Talia, a love written in blood and time. He was the most powerful man in the city. She was the only person he was ever afraid to lose. They took her from him at 16. It took 9 years, a conspiracy, and one terrible night for her to come back. This is what happened in between. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Was Born to Rule. The world does not announce its kings. It simply makes room for them, quietly, inevitably, the way water parts around stone. Kingston Adlar was born on a Thursday in October in a private hospital suite on the 42nd floor of a building his family owned. The city spread beneath the window like something laid at his feet. His mother said he did not cry when he entered the world. He simply opened his eyes, dark amber, already ancient, and looked around the room as though taking inventory. His father, Rael Adlar, stood at the window with his back to everyone. When the nurse brought the boy to him, Rael turned, looked down at his son for a long moment, and said only, "He's here." The men in the room, advisors, elders, 2 doctors who had signed documents they would never speak about, exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath for years. They called the bloodline the Adlar line. Not royalty in the way of crowns and thrones. This was modern, layered, embedded in institutions, and influenced the way roots embed in stone. The Adlars controlled things quietly: industry, territory, the invisible architecture of power that most people never noticed because it was built to look like everything else. But within certain circles, old circles, circles that kept records in leather-bound books and met in rooms without windows, the Adlar line was something older than commerce. Something that went back further than anyone liked to say in public. Alpha bloodline. The kind of leadership that was not learned but carried. In the jaw, in the bearing, in the way a room shifted when the right person walked into it. Kingston grew into all of it. By 8 years old, he could sit through a 3-hour briefing without moving. By 10, he was solving territorial disputes between his father's associates that grown men had botched for months, not with force, but with a quiet clarity that left everyone slightly unsettled. He had a gift for seeing exactly what people needed to hear and delivering it without cruelty and without softness. Simply truth, shaped like a key. He was generous in ways that confused the men around his father. He gave without being asked. He remembered names, groundskeepers, drivers, the woman who brought tea to the 3rd-floor meetings. He would stop and speak to them with the same full attention he gave to men twice his age. This would later become the thing his enemies hated most about him. His heart was not a weakness they could exploit because it was not naive. It was chosen, deliberate. An alpha's generosity, the kind that builds an army from loyalty rather than fear. But it was the garden that mattered. A shared garden between the Adlar estate and the neighboring estate of the Maren family, walled in old stone, filled with an oak tree that had been there longer than either house. Kingston had always been drawn to it. As a child, he would escape there from lessons, from briefings, from the weight of being watched. He was 11 the first time he looked through the iron gate in the stone wall and saw someone already there. A girl, sitting under the oak tree. She was reading, cross-legged, completely at home in a place he had assumed was his alone. Dark hair loose around her shoulders, completely unbothered by his stare. Then she looked up, and her dark eyes, large, gold-flecked, direct as a challenge, met his. Neither of them moved. Then she went back to her book. Kingston stood at the gate for another full minute before quietly opening it and walking in. He didn't know that afternoon that she had been watching him through that gate for 2 weeks. He didn't know that both their families had been watching both of them, waiting for exactly this moment. He didn't know that the elders on both sides had written about this pairing in their records before either child could read. He only knew that when he sat down under that oak tree, 3 feet away from a girl who didn't move or speak to acknowledge him, it was the first time in his life he felt entirely, completely at rest. That was the beginning of everything. And the beginning of everything that would eventually break them both. Chapter 2: The Girl in the Garden. Her name was Talia Maren, and she had never once in her life done what was expected of her. The Maren family was old in the same way the Adlar family was old, roots that went deeper than their modern surface suggested, a lineage tracked in private records, a bloodline that the elders spoke of with the same careful reverence. Where the Adlars carried alpha command, force, direction, the kind of leadership that moved through a room like weather, the Marens carried something complementary and equally formidable: discernment, strategy, an almost preternatural ability to see the thing behind the thing. To read a room the way others read a page. Talia had inherited all of it, and then made it her own. She had been reading since she was 3. By 7, she had devoured her family's library and started on the neighbors. She climbed trees her parents asked her not to climb, questioned adults in ways that made them shift uncomfortably, and had a stillness about her. When she chose stillness, that felt borrowed from something much older than a 10-year-old. The elders on her family's side had told Talia's mother, when Talia was still an infant, "She will be to the alpha what water is to fire. Not to extinguish, to complete." Her mother had written it down in the family record and never spoken of it aloud. But she had watched the Adlar boy through the years, through social gatherings, across the stone wall between the gardens, and she had begun, quietly, to understand what the elders meant. The boy was force without direction whenever he was unsettled. Her daughter was direction without force when she held back. Together, even as children, something aligned between them that had no good word in modern language. The first afternoon Kingston sat under the oak tree, 3 feet away from Talia, not speaking. She gave him 4 minutes before she said, without looking up from her book, "If you're going to sit here, you should sit properly. You're listing to the left." Kingston straightened automatically. Then he caught himself and looked at her. She was still reading. "How did you know?" he said. "Peripheral vision," she said. "You're very tall. It's hard to miss." He stared at her for another moment. Then slowly he almost smiled. It was the beginning of the only friendship that had ever asked anything real of him. Years passed in that garden. Seasons turned through it. Summer heat that made the ivy on the stone walls lush and dark. Autumn that turned the oak tree amber and gold. Kingston always noticed, without saying, that the color matched Talia's eyes in certain light. Winter that left frost on the iron gate and brought them indoors to the estate libraries. Spring that returned them to their tree like a ritual neither had named. They fought constantly. About ideas, about strategy, about which of them was right. And they were matched so evenly that it never resolved, only evolved. Kingston would make a sweeping declaration. Talia would dismantle it in 3 sentences. He would rebuild it. She would modify. By the end they had usually arrived somewhere neither had started. He was the only person who could outweigh her patience. She was the only person whose arguments actually altered his thinking. They did not speak about what they were to each other. They were 12, then 13, then 14, and the silence around the actual thing became its own language. It was Kingston's 14th birthday when he held her hand for the first time. Not romantically, or so he told himself. She had tripped on the garden's uneven stone path in the dark. They had started meeting at night by then, when no one was watching. He had caught her arm, steadied her, and then, without releasing, simply held her hand. She went very still. He felt her pulse under his fingers. Quick. Betraying her. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The oak tree overhead was enormous and dark against the night sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, their families were hosting a dinner neither wanted to attend. Here was different. Here was theirs. Talia finally said, very quietly, "You can let go now." Kingston said, "I know." He didn't let go for another 4 minutes. She didn't pull away. Their families knew what they were too young to say. The elders on both sides had begun preliminary conversations, careful, formal, honoring the old protocols. It was not arranged in the modern sense. It was recognized, witnessed, like identifying a constellation that had always been there. You didn't create it. You simply finally named it. Both families watched their children in the garden that winter, through the frost-edged windows of the estate, and saw two people already becoming what they were always going to be. What no one saw, not the families, not the elders, not the advisors in their careful rooms, were the other people watching. The ones who had begun, quietly, to understand that when Kingston Adlar finally came into his full power, he would need someone equally matched to stand beside him. And that Talia Maren, gold-eyed and unbreakable, was exactly that person. Some people see a perfect thing and want to be near it. Others see it and want to take it apart. Chapter 3: The Last Night in the Garden. Kingston was 17 when the shape of the danger finally became visible to him. He had felt it for months, a texture beneath the surface of his world that was wrong in the way certain silences are wrong. He noticed it in the way some of his father's closest men looked at him when they thought he wasn't watching. Not with the respect they performed to his face. With something else. Something that lived in the back of the jaw, behind the eye. Envy that had curdled into something with teeth. He was too handsome. They said it like an accusation, as though beauty were something he had taken from them. He was too liked. Staff, associates, people who had worked against the Adlar name for years had begun shifting their allegiance simply because Kingston had spoken to them honestly once and meant it. He was too generous. He gave away advantages they felt should have been leveraged. He was too certain without being brittle. He could absorb criticism and redirect it without losing the thread of who he was, and there is nothing more enraging to a small person than someone who cannot be diminished. They began meeting without him. Kingston did not yet know the specifics. But he felt the shape of it, the way you feel a storm before the sky shows you anything. He had said nothing to his father. His father was old and unwell, and Kingston would not add this weight to him. He had said nothing to his advisors. Some of them, he was beginning to suspect, were already on the other side. There was only one person he could tell. He found Talia in the garden at dusk, their usual hour in the winter months, before the cold fully settled. She was sitting on the stone wall near the oak tree, legs hanging over the edge, reading with a small lamp clipped to her book. When she heard him, she looked up immediately. She always knew it was him before she saw him. Kingston walked to her without greeting and sat beside her on the wall. He was already tall enough that his feet still reached the ground on the other side. For a moment he said nothing, just looked at the garden, the dark stone, the oak tree he had been climbing since he was 11. Talia closed her book. She did not ask what was wrong. She waited for him. "Something is building," he said finally. "Against me. Inside the circle." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." He looked at her sharply. "You know?" "I've seen it for 3 months," she said, her voice completely level. "I didn't know how to tell you without being wrong. I wanted to be sure." "Are you sure?" She held his gaze. "Yes." He exhaled slowly. Something loosened in his chest, not relief, but the particular release of being correctly understood. She was the only person on earth who could do that for him. They stayed in the garden until the cold became undeniable. Kingston talked. Talia listened and periodically cut in with a question that reorganized everything he'd said into something clearer. She had always done this restructuring gift, and he had always relied on it more than he would admit. At the end, when the night had fully settled and the amber lights of the estate were reflected in the frost on the stone path, Kingston reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and brought out a thin leather cord bracelet. Simple. Dark cord, a single small hammered metal clasp. "I made this," he said, which was not something Kingston Adlar typically said. Talia looked at it, then at him. "With your hands?" "Don't make it strange," he said. It's not a thing. It's just," he stopped. "Keep it, so you have something from me. If anything." "Stop," she said quietly. Not harsh, just firm. "Don't talk about things ending." "I'm not," he said. "I'm talking about things continuing. Even if something." She took the bracelet from his hand. Their fingers touched for a long moment. Then she fastened it around her wrist. What happened next was swift and terrible in the way that prepared violence always is. It looks like chaos from outside, but was planned with cold precision. At 11:47 that same night, cars arrived at the Maren estate. Not hostile in appearance, official-looking, quiet, the kind of vehicles that suggest authority and arrangement. There were raised voices inside. Then doors opened. Talia's family emerged with bags that were too quickly packed for the scale of their household. Too few bags, the wrong things grabbed. Her mother's face, white, controlled, performing calm for the children, even though her hands were wrong. Kingston was still in his room when he heard it. He was at his window in under 30 seconds. He saw the cars. He saw the gate opening. He ran. By the time he reached the estate entrance, the last car was pulling away. He ran into the road, and for one suspended, terrible second, the rear window of the last car was close enough that he saw her.
Talia.
Facing backwards. Her hand pressed flat against the glass. The leather cord bracelet on her wrist. Her eyes found his, gold-flecked, enormous, holding the look for as long as physics allowed. Then the car turned. The road was empty. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally came down. He stood in the rain for a long time. When he finally walked back through the gate, back through the garden, past the oak tree, past the stone wall where they had sat for the last time an hour ago, without knowing it was the last time, he stopped. He sat down on the wet stone path. And Kingston Adlar, who had never in his 17 years on Earth allowed himself to break in front of anyone, put his face in his hands for 3 minutes. Then he stood up, walked inside, and began making plans. Some losses make you soft. The right losses, the ones that know exactly where to cut, make you something else entirely. He was going to need to be something else entirely. Chapter 4: Wolves in the Palace. 9 years. Kingston Adlar at 26 was not the boy who stood in the rain. He was what that boy became when he took grief and turned it to fuel, when he decided that the world that had taken Talia from him was going to understand, in time, that removing her had not removed what she had built in him. He was extraordinary in the way that very few people manage, not just in what he commanded, but in what he inspired. He had taken his father's empire and restructured it, modernized it, driven it into sectors his father's generation hadn't imagined. He had grown the Adlar reach through loyalty rather than coercion, and the loyal organizations he built were more durable and more devoted than anything fear had ever constructed. He was also, objectively, devastating to look at. His height, his build, the breadth of his shoulders had become something people remarked on when they thought he wasn't listening. His face had settled from teenage intensity into something harder and more precise. The jaw, the scar, the dark amber eyes that saw everything and performed nothing. Women wanted his attention. Men wanted his approval. He gave both more rarely than people expected and more genuinely when he did. This was the thing that undid his enemies. He could not be played the usual way. The conspiracy against him had been building for 4 years. He suspected it. Talia had warned him. 9 years ago, in a garden, before she disappeared, and that warning had never left him. He had spent years identifying the architecture of the threat. Who, how much, what they wanted. He was careful. He was patient. He moved his most trusted people into positions they could defend. He kept certain knowledge behind walls that looked like ignorance. But they were patient too. The core of it was 3 men, all from within his own inner circle, all of whom had been with his father before him. Maddox, his head of operations. Stern, who controlled the communications network. And Dane, who had been Kingston's personal advisor since he was 19 and who Kingston had trusted with things he trusted no one else with. It was the Dane revelation that would hurt the most when it came. They wanted what he had, all of it, but more than the material empire, more than the territory and the influence, they wanted the thing that could not be transferred. They wanted to be the reason people entered a room differently. They wanted the loyalty his generosity had built to somehow, someday, belong to them instead. They wanted the indefinable alpha quality that made Kingston Adlar the gravitational center of every space he occupied, and since they couldn't take it, they had decided to destroy it. Their plan was elegant in its cruelty: discredit him publicly, sever his alliances through misinformation, isolate him from the few people still in his corner, and engineer a situation that would make his removal from power look like the inevitable result of his own failures. They had been building it for 4 years. Kingston, alone in his penthouse at night, would stand at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, still impossibly beautiful from this height, still laid out like something offered, and feel the wrongness like a pressure in his chest. He had Talia's bracelet still. Not on his wrist. He kept it on the nightstand, where he would see it first thing and last thing every day. He had never stopped looking for her. In the early years, it had been desperate investigators, contacts, every thread he could pull. Information would surface and dissolve. Her family had been moved by people with resources and motivation, which told him the conspiracy was older than he'd realized, that the forces against him had been working to remove his greatest potential ally even before they had properly moved against him. Later, the search became something quieter, more certain. He did not believe she was dead, not because the evidence ruled it out, but because Kingston Adlar had loved Talia Maren since he was 11 years old in a garden, and some things you know through the chest rather than the mind. She was out there. She was becoming something. And someday the city, his city, which knew him like a body knows its own nerve endings, would bring her back to him. He could wait. He had learned waiting from a girl under an oak tree who never looked up when she heard the gate open but always knew it was him. He didn't know she was already 3 blocks away. He didn't know she had been in his city for 11 days. He didn't know that she had found the edge of the conspiracy that was dismantling him and had begun, with the particular precision of someone who had spent 9 years turning grief into a weapon, to dismantle it back. He didn't know any of that yet. But the leather cord bracelet on his nightstand was warm in the amber light, and Kingston had always trusted warmth. Chapter 5: The Woman Called Warrior. They had tried to make her small. Whoever had engineered the Maren family's removal from the city, from Kingston's orbit, from the place where 2 bloodlines were about to complete each other, had clearly intended for Talia to simply disappear. Be absorbed into relocation. Be reduced to geography. Become a woman who had once been near greatness, and then wasn't anymore. It had not gone the way they planned. The years of displacement had been brutal in the honest way that certain experiences are: no softening, no mercy, just the full weight of circumstance landing exactly where it must. Talia's family had been fragmented in the move. Her mother eventually settled. Her younger siblings adapted. Talia herself had ended up, at 17, in a situation that required her to be capable in ways that 17-year-olds should not need to be capable. She became capable. Combat training first because the world had shown her, in those first displaced years, that strength was not negotiable. She was gifted. The same physical intelligence that had made her strategically formidable as a child translated into physical language with extraordinary efficiency. She was not the biggest person in any room she trained in. She was usually the most precise. Her trainers, 3 of them across 5 years, each one she eventually exceeded, would later say variations of the same thing. She didn't fight like someone who'd been taught. She fought like someone who remembered. Strategic intelligence came naturally, had always come naturally, but she built on it rigorously, systematically. Languages. Networks. Information architecture. She built a small organization of people who trusted her absolutely. For individuals, each one exceptional in a specific domain, each one someone the mainstream world had underestimated. They were quiet, loyal, and extraordinarily effective. She did all of this with one underlying purpose, though she would not have said so aloud, even to herself, for the first several years. She was working her way back. At 23, she found the first thread. It was buried in financial records she had no official right to access, but Talia Maren had spent years learning to exist in spaces she had no official right to access. The thread was small. A transaction pattern. A name connected to another name that connected back to the Adlar family circle in a way that had no innocent explanation. She pulled it, and the conspiracy against Kingston, the architecture of it, the faces of it, the years-long patient engineering of his destruction, unspooled before her like something that had been waiting to be found. She sat with the information for 3 days. Ate very little. Slept in increments. Mapped everything she found against everything she already knew. On the 4th day, she went to her window, a 3rd-floor window in a city that was not yet his, and looked at the street below for a long time. Then she went back to her wall and drew a line from where she was to where she needed to be. She thought about him constantly and had managed this, over the years, by not calling it thinking about him. She thought about the problem. She thought about the mission. She thought about the strategic situation and what it required. But at night, in the margins of sleep, she was 11 again under the oak tree, and he was coming through the iron gate, already too tall, already too certain of where he was going even when he had nowhere specific to go. She could still feel the weight of his hand over hers on the garden wall. She could still hear him saying, "I know," and not letting go. She kept the bracelet because it was the right thing to do, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Some things you keep because they are yours regardless of whether you are together or not. That bracelet was hers. The boy who made it with his hands was complicated. The man he had become was someone she was going to have to encounter with all her armor fastened and all her feelings locked below the waterline. She was a warrior. She could do that. She hoped. At 25, having spent the better part of 2 years in other cities mapping, preparing, and waiting for the right moment, Talia Maren arrived in Kingston City. She did not announce herself. She took a room in a mid-range hotel under a name that was not hers, met with her team in a rotating sequence of locations, and began moving through the outer rings of Kingston's world, invisibly, carefully, like a hand sliding into a mechanism it has studied for years. She saw his name everywhere. His face on buildings, in papers, in the ambient reverence people in his city held for him, and even through the conspiracy's erosion of his reputation, the reverence held in the ordinary people the conspirators couldn't reach. It told her everything she needed to know about what he had built and what was worth saving. She had been in the city 11 days when she saw him in person for the first time in 9 years. He was across a crowded atrium at a public industry gathering. Dark suit. No tie. Impossibly tall, even across a full room. He was speaking to someone, head slightly inclined, and even at this distance, she could see the quality of his attention, the full, real, chosen attention that had always been one of his most quietly devastating qualities. She watched him for 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked the other way before her face could betray her. She did not allow herself to name what moved through her in those 4 seconds. She put it behind the waterline and kept walking. She had work to do first. He had to be safe before he could know she was here. She was not going to let herself be a distraction from the very thing she had come back to prevent. But 4 seconds had been enough to confirm. The boy from the garden was still in there. She could see him in the way Kingston Adlar stood, in the way he listened, in the particular stillness he carried that she had memorized under an oak tree when she was 11. "Not yet," she said softly to no one as she stepped out into the night. "Not yet." Chapter 6 Collision Course. He thought about it for 3 days afterward. Not the event itself. He had appeared, performed the necessary social architecture of his position, and departed with the efficiency he applied to everything. He thought about the moment he'd paused. The thing in the air he had felt, not heard, not seen, felt like a frequency shift. Like a key change in a piece of music you know so well that a wrong note lands in your chest before your ears register it. He said nothing to anyone. There was no language for it that didn't sound absurd in daylight. I felt her. I felt that she was in the room. But he had felt it. He was certain. He started sleeping less. His attention, already fractured by the tightening conspiracy, now had this additional splinter. The sensation that something long waited for was close. He had trained himself over 9 years not to hope too specifically. Hope with a face attached to it was the kind that undid you when it didn't arrive. He had hoped in the abstract, kept the bracelet, kept the garden. Now the hope was threatening to become specific again. He didn't know what to do with that. Talia, 3 miles away, was not sleeping either. She had spent the intervening days pulling apart the conspiracy's final architecture. The pieces were almost all in place now, and what she found at the center was worse than she had anticipated. The trap for Kingston was not simply reputational. It was physical. There was an endgame being planned that would not leave room for him to recover. She moved faster. She started feeding counterintelligence into the conspiracy's communications, carefully, invisibly, designed to create doubt and delay between the 3 central figures without alerting them to the source. She rebuilt 3 of Kingston's severed alliances through intermediaries who didn't know she was the common threat. Up the final sequence of their intended attack and identified the one night it was scheduled to execute. She had 6 days. On day 3, she made her second error. The first had been the 4 seconds in the atrium. She was following Dane, Kingston's compromised advisor, through a mid-city district, maintaining the correct distance, when Dane turned unexpectedly into a private building and Talia had to accelerate to not lose him. She moved quickly through the lobby, took a different stairwell, and came out on the building's 2nd floor just in time to see Dane meeting with 2 other men in a glass-walled conference room. She paused in the corridor to observe the meeting, and then Kingston stepped out of the elevator 8 feet behind her. She heard him before she turned. The particular way he moved, she had always known it, the specific weight distribution, the near silence of him for someone so large. 9 years and her body still new. She turned her face away instantly, stepped to the side. A column between them. He walked past. 3 feet. She could hear him breathing. He passed. She did not exhale until she heard the conference room door open and close behind him. Then she pressed her back against the column and stood completely still for 30 full seconds, long enough to let the physical reaction pass, to compress it back below the waterline. Her hand was pressed flat against the wall. The leather cord bracelet was against the painted surface. She had been close enough to touch him. She hadn't. She made herself move. Down the corridor, down the stairs, out the side entrance into the cold city air. She walked 3 blocks before she stopped and made herself breathe properly.
"Not yet," she said.
Not yet. Not yet. The conspiracy had 6 days to execute. She had 5 days to stop it before he needed to know she was here. She needed 5 clean days. She went back to work. That same night, 3 miles away, Kingston stood at his penthouse window. The rain had started. He watched it move across the glass in long, cold lines and felt, again, the frequency shift, the key change, that particular thing in the air that he had no language for and had stopped trying to translate. He picked up the bracelet from the nightstand, held it. "Where are you?" he said quietly, to the rain, to the city, to no one and everyone. Across the city, Talia looked at the bracelet on her wrist. Neither of them knew they had just asked the same question. Chapter 7: The Setup. Day 2 of Talia's 5-day window, and the conspirators accelerated their timeline. Something, she would never identify exactly what, had made them nervous. Perhaps an instinct that their window was closing. Perhaps Dane had noticed something. Whatever the cause, what had been scheduled for 6 days out was now executing in 48 hours, and the first move was public. A coordinated release of fabricated information, documents that looked genuine because they had been constructed over years by people who understood how genuine documents looked. Financial irregularities attributed to Kingston. Decisions reframed as criminal. Generosities recast as leverage. The narrative was surgical. It did not try to make Kingston look like a monster. It tried to make him look incompetent and corrupt. The kind of leader who had always been too good to be true because no one that good could be real. It hit every major platform simultaneously at 6 in the morning. Kingston woke to it. By noon, 3 of his remaining allies had publicly distanced themselves. By 2 o'clock, his communications network, controlled by Stern, had gone dark on his end. He could make calls. No one was returning them. He drove to Dane's office at 3 and found it empty and locked. His security chief, one of the few he still fully trusted, told him quietly that men with credentials he didn't recognize had been seen at 3 of the Adlar buildings that morning. The trap had closed. Kingston sat in his car outside Dane's empty building for 7 minutes. His hands were on the wheel. He was thinking, cataloging, refusing, even now, the paralysis that wanted to set in. He had known something like this was coming. He had moved pieces to defend against it. But they had been faster than he'd anticipated, and now he was 3 moves behind in a game with a clock. He drove to the only place that still felt real. He walked through the garden for a long time. The rain increased. He didn't go inside. He sat on the wet stone wall, the same wall where he and Talia had sat on the last night, and let the rain come down. His dark hair was wet. His overcoat was wet. He didn't move. He thought about his father. His father had built something worth building and had loved Kingston in the quiet, enormous, inadequately expressed way of men who were raised to lead rather than to speak. He had died 3 years ago, and Kingston had carried the grief of it the same way he carried everything, inside, behind the waterline, compressed into fuel. He thought about Talia. He always thought about Talia eventually when he was in this garden. It was inevitable. She was embedded in the stone, in the tree, in the iron gate. She was in the particular weight of rain on his shoulders in this specific enclosed space. She was in the cold air and the amber light and the sound of water on old stone. He put his face in his hands. Not for long. He wasn't 17 anymore. But for a moment. Just a moment of being absolutely, honestly, not all right. Then he heard a voice behind him. Low. Controlled. Completely unmistakable. You shouldn't be here alone. He lifted his face from his hands.
He turned.
The rain was coming down. The garden was dark except for the amber light of the estate behind him. A figure stood at the far edge of the garden, near the stone wall, near the iron gate, still half in shadow.
Tall. Lithe.
Rain-soaked. Black hair coming loose from its tie. Gold-flecked dark eyes catching the amber light. Kingston stood up from the wall. He did not move. He could not, for 3 full seconds, move. 9 years. She was here. She was real. She was standing in his garden in the rain and looking at him exactly the way she always had, with that full, fearless, non-performative attention that had always made him feel both completely seen and entirely unprepared. His voice, when it finally came, was very low and very unsteady. Talia. Chapter 8. She came back. She walked toward him. Not running. She never ran toward anything emotionally. This was Talia, who had spent 9 years learning to move through the world without letting it see her urgency. She crossed the space between them at a measured pace, and Kingston watched every step and did not move because he was afraid, with an honesty he would never have admitted to anyone else, that if he moved he would do something he hadn't been given permission to do. She stopped 2 feet from him, close enough that he could see the rain on her eyelashes. She looked up at him. He had always been much taller, and the full extent of his height was more striking now that he was fully grown. She scanned him. Face, posture, condition. The warrior's assessment. Not clinical, but the emotional response was being held below the waterline. She was checking if he was all right. He was not all right. You know, he said. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just, you know everything that's happening. Yes, she said. For 2 years. He absorbed this. You've been working, she said. You have 3 days. Maybe less. He wanted to say many things. He had been mentally composing them, in various forms, for 9 years. All the things he would say if he ever had the chance to say them. What he said was, "Are you all right?" Something moved across her face, briefly, barely visible. Then it was gone. "I'm fine," she said. "Are you?"
"No," he said.
"But that's the first honest thing I've said in about a month." A pause. She almost smiled. It was very small and very carefully controlled, but he saw it because he had memorized every register of her face when he was 11 years old and had never deleted the file.
"Good," she said.
"I need you honest for this. Come inside." He followed her without a word. She explained everything. It took 40 minutes. He did not interrupt her, which was not nothing, because Kingston Adlar interrupted people constantly with the restless precision of someone who processed faster than speech. He did not interrupt Talia. He stood opposite her at the table and listened and absorbed, and when she finished, the silence lasted for a full 30 seconds. "Dane," he said finally. "Yes." "How long?" "For years minimum." She hesitated. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "Don't be. It's better to know." The room felt different once she stopped speaking. The urgency settled into something else, and the something else was the particular atmosphere that had always existed between them, the one that neither of them had vocabulary for and neither of them could quite manage to ignore. It was in the way he kept track of her position in the room, even while looking at the documents. It was in the way she oriented her explanations to his processing style, without consciously deciding to. She caught herself doing it and straightened. "I need to go," she said. "I have things moving. I'll be back at dawn with the next." "Where are you staying?" he said. "That's not important." "Talia. Kingston." He held her gaze. She held his. This was also familiar, the exact specific war of their silences. "Hotel," she said finally. "It's fine."
"Stay here," he said.
"The East Wing is empty. You'd have the space." She stayed. She would tell herself, if pressed, that it was strategically sensible. Easier access to the estate's resources, less transit time, a base of operations closer to the center of what was about to happen. She would not tell herself the rest of it. He showed her to the East Wing without ceremony, without pressure, without any of the things she had been preparing herself to deflect. At the door of the room, she turned to say something efficient and final, and found him looking at her with the dark amber eyes open in a way she had only ever seen in the garden, unguarded, unperforming. The boy from the Iron Gate. "I knew you weren't gone," he said quietly. "I never," he stopped. "I just knew." She looked at him for a long moment.
"So did I," she said,
and closed the door. She leaned against it in the dark of the room and stood there for a full minute, pressing the leather cord bracelet against her wrist with her other hand, feeling the particular shape of it, familiar as breathing, until her heartbeat did what she told it. Chapter 9: Steel and Memory. In the garden years, they had debated ideas. Now they debated strategy, and it was the same. Exactly the same. The rhythm of it, the push and pull, the way her precision interrupted his momentum, and his momentum carried her precision further than it would go alone. He would reach a conclusion faster than anyone else in any room. She would already be 2 steps past it. Together they were closing time. They worked through the dawn and into morning without stopping. Her team arrived at 7:03 of the 4, cycling through in windows, bringing updates and taking instructions. Kingston watched how they responded to her. Quickly, completely, without the particular performance of deference that meant someone was second-guessing behind compliance. She had earned this. Whatever she had been through in 9 years had earned her this loyalty. He said nothing. But something in his chest shifted with a feeling he had no name for, something in the neighborhood of pride, but less conditional than pride. More like recognition. There you are. There is what you became. The moments between the work were the dangerous ones. She was checking his shoulder. He had moved wrong, reaching for something on a high shelf, and a previously ignored tension there had made itself known, and her hands were on him, professional and quick, and he was very still. Sitting on the edge of the work table while she stood in front of him, pressing carefully along his shoulder to identify the point of strain. "There," she said, finding it. "I know," he said. "I've known for about a week." Why didn't you deal with it? He glanced sideways at her. I had other things on. You should deal with it. You should have told me you were in the city. Her hands paused. That's not the same, she said. Isn't it? She stepped back. He let her. That afternoon, during a pause in the work, her team gone, Kingston on a call in the other room, Talia stood at the estate window and looked at the garden. The oak tree. The stone path. The iron gate in the far wall. She had been trying not to look at it. She had, over the past 18 hours, been rigorously successful at not looking at it. Now she looked. Everything was still there. Older, slightly different in scale, the garden more overgrown at the edges than she remembered, but the bones of it exactly as she had held it in her memory for 9 years.
The tree.
The wall. The path where she had tripped and he had caught her hand and then, very deliberately, not let go. She pressed her fingers to the glass, then dropped her hand. She heard him come back into the room. She didn't turn. Do you still, she started, then stopped. What, he said, from behind her.
The garden, she said.
Do you still go there?
Every week, he said.
Sometimes more. She nodded once, still not turning. Good, she said quietly. I'm glad you kept it. A silence. Then his voice, just slightly lower. It's ours. I kept ours. She didn't answer. But she pressed her fingers to the bracelet, and he saw her do it, and neither of them spoke about it. He picked up the bracelet on the nightstand that evening. He had moved it from his room to the work table at some point during the day. Why, he hadn't examined. And now it was there among the documents, and he picked it up without quite meaning to, and sat holding it. Feeling the worn cord, the small hammered clasp that was softer now than it had been, because it had been held so often. She walked past behind him and stopped. He heard her stop. He didn't put it down or turn around. She looked at what he was holding for a long moment. Then she held up her wrist, the matching bracelet. Same cord. Same clasp. Same wear. I never took mine off, she said.
He turned then.
Looked at her. Then at the bracelet on his nightstand. Then at the one on her wrist. I know, he said. I saw it the moment I turned around in the garden. Why didn't you say something? Because, he said, I was afraid if I said something it would become a thing to manage, and I needed you as a partner first. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, that was the right call. I know, he said. Again. The almost smile.
More visible this time.
Chapter 10. The night of the fight. The night came down hard and fast. Talia's intelligence had identified the location, a private venue 3 miles from the estate, owned through 4 layers of shell companies by Maddox's organization. The endgame meeting. All 3 conspirators in one place, the final execution of their plan, and a physical component she had not fully shared with Kingston until now. She told him in the car. They were going to have you removed, she said. Permanently. Tonight. Someone hired in from outside. Kingston was quiet for 4 seconds. Tonight. They moved the timeline when they saw the public narrative stalling. Their plan needed you unable to respond. How did you know it stalled?
Because I stalled it, she said.
2 days ago. They haven't identified the interference yet. He looked at her profile in the car's dim light. You stalled a coordinated misinformation campaign from a hotel room. I had help, she said. My team is good. Your team, he said, is extraordinary. A beat. You are extraordinary. She kept her eyes on the road. We have 8 minutes. Talia. 8 minutes, she said firmly. The operation was precise the way Talia had planned everything since she was 11. No wasted motion, no unnecessary variables. Her team had the exterior. She and Kingston took the interior. The building had 2 floors and 3 active threats, and 1 hired external who was eliminated from the equation silently by her best person before Kingston and Talia even reached the main floor. Kingston moved through a confrontation the way Storm moves through open country, immovable, complete, with a force that seemed effortless because it was so certain of itself. He was trained, but more than trained. He was alpha by blood, and in a moment of genuine physical conflict, something came online in him that went past technique into something ancient and undeniable. Two of Maddox's men in the corridor. Kingston handled both in 11 seconds. He took a cut to his forearm in the process, a knife he didn't fully move from, because moving fully from it would have meant moving into the second man's reach. He chose the lesser. He didn't slow down. Talia on the parallel corridor was something else to witness. Where Kingston was overwhelming, she was invisible until she was inevitable. She moved through two adversaries with the lightning precision of someone who had trained for years to be exactly right rather than merely forceful. One move, one displacement, one redirection of momentum, and people found themselves on the floor with no clear memory of how they got there. She intercepted the fourth man coming up the stairs before he reached Kingston's position, turned him against his own trajectory, and had him neutralized before he finished falling. Then she looked up and met Kingston's eyes across the space. A second between them, both breathing harder, his forearm bleeding quietly. She nodded once. Forward. The final confrontation was in the upper room. All three conspirators were there, Maddox, Stern, and Dane. When the door opened and they saw who stood in it, the temperature of the room changed completely. Dane's face did something complicated and then went still. Kingston looked at him for a long moment, just looked, and in that look was everything. The years, the trust, the specific flavor of a betrayal that comes from someone you chose. Dane looked away first. Then Kingston turned to Maddox. He did not shout. He did not perform anything. He was very calm and very large and very certain, and the certainty, the alpha certainty that could not be performed or faked, was more devastating than volume. "It's done," he said simply. And it was. Afterward, in the aftermath quiet, Kingston stood just inside the building's rear entrance. Rain outside. Talia's team was handling the documentation, the recordings, the clean delivery of evidence to the right people that would, by morning, make everything public in a way that could not be managed or suppressed. Talia came to him. She looked at the cloth around his forearm. "There's another cut on your shoulder," she said. "I know. We should." "In a minute," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. She stopped. She stood beside him. They looked at the rain together. The garden was 20 minutes away.
"Kingston," she said.
"Take me back to the garden." He turned to look at her. Her gold-flecked eyes were very direct and very open, and for once the waterline was absent. She was not holding anything below it. She was asking him a clear, true thing in a clear, true voice. He took her hand, led her out into the rain. Chapter 11: Rain and Reckoning. The rain was heavier by the time they reached the garden. They had driven mostly in silence. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people for whom speech would be insufficient, and both of them knew it. His hand had been on the gear shift. Her hand had been in her lap. The leather cord bracelet on her wrist had caught the amber of passing streetlights. He had watched it in his peripheral vision the entire drive. He had changed, quickly, between the building and the car, into dark trousers and a brief open leather vest, the kind that crossed his chest and left his arms exposed and his shoulders bare above it. He had not thought about the choice. He had simply grabbed what was there. The cut on his forearm was wrapped, but the bandaging was minimal, practical. The wound on his shoulder had been addressed with the same efficiency. He looked, in the amber rain, like something from before, from the older language that his bloodline was written in. Like the alpha his family records described, and his modern life, usually translated into board meetings and overcoats. Talia entered the garden behind him. She stopped a few steps in and looked at him, standing in the rain with his back partially to her, rain on his bare shoulders, the oak tree behind him exactly as she remembered it from every dream she'd had in 9 years of not being here. Something in her went very quiet. He heard her stop and turned. They looked at each other across the rain-soaked garden path. Both wet, both carrying the night, the fight, the relief, the 9 years, the garden in their respective bodies. She walked toward him slowly. He stayed very still. She stopped in front of him and looked up at the jaw, the scar, the dark amber eyes that were looking at her with nothing held back, all the waterlines gone. He had always had a face that was difficult to be fully looked at in because of what it did when it was open. She had known this since she was 11. She had thought over the years that she had prepared herself for it. She had not. She reached out and touched the wound on his forearm. One finger, two, very lightly, the way you would touch something precious, or something that still causes you pain, or something that is both. His skin was rain-cool, and the muscle beneath it jumped slightly at the contact. He went completely still. Her touch moved along the bandaging, checking, but also just touching him. Just the fact of it. 9 years, and this was the first time her hands had been on him for a reason that wasn't entirely strategic. He lifted his hand and covered hers, not stopping it, just resting over it. Large, warm despite the rain. She could feel the steadiness of him through his palm. She looked up. He was already looking at her. "You came back," he said, very quietly, like a statement that was also a prayer that had been answered. She almost smiled. The full version of the almost smile, closer than it had ever been. "You needed someone to." "I needed you to," he said, specifically. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain, the garden, the oak tree above them, his hand over hers, the bracelet on her wrist. "I know," she said. Her word, his word, both of theirs. Then, slowly, in the garden they had shared since they were children, under the oak tree that had stood through both their absences, with the rain coming down exactly as it had the night she was taken from him, Talia Maren turned her hand over beneath his, and they laced their fingers together. They stood there. The rain came down. The oak tree shed water from its branches in long silver lines around them. The amber estate lights made everything warm at the edges. The city existed beyond the stone walls, going about its night with no knowledge of what had just settled into place in this small, walled, ancient garden. He was not cold. She was not cold. They were both soaking wet, and neither of them was going inside yet. He looked at their hands. She was looking at his face. He could feel her looking at him, and when he raised his eyes to meet hers, the full volume of it, 9 years, 2 children under a tree, a bracelet made by hand, a disappearance, a return, a fight won, and this ordinary, extraordinary moment of 2 people whose hands had always known each other finally holding on. He felt all of it move through him like weather. "Talia," he said. "I know," she said, before he could finish. "I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're going to say." He looked at her. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "And I know the answer too." He was quiet for a moment. The rain. The garden. "What's the answer?" he said. She squeezed his hand. Very slightly. Looked at him. "Yes," she said. Chapter 12. What was always theirs. They came inside eventually. Her wounds were looked at. Minor. Several. Each one that Kingston found made him go briefly still in a way that Talia decided not to comment on. His forearm was properly redressed. His shoulder attended to. They changed into dry things and met in the estate's main room, where the fire was lit and the world outside was still raining but quieter now. They talked. They talked in the way that people talk when years of unsaid things are finally being released, not in a flood but in a controlled excavation. Questions that had waited for their moment. Silences that arrived not as barriers, but as pauses to absorb what had just been placed between them. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "After. When they moved you?" "Yes," she said. "Not for long. Fear is expensive." "I know. I was angrier than I was afraid," she said. "After the first month." "What did you do with it?" She almost smiled. "Made it useful." He looked at her. "I spent 3 years thinking you might be dead, and then decided I wouldn't believe it." "Good," she said quietly. "It would have been a waste." "I didn't think of it as waste," he said, very evenly. "I thought of it as," he stopped. "Unacceptable." Somewhere in the second hour, Talia reached into her collar and brought out a small thing on a cord. Not jewelry exactly. A tiny piece of iron, hammered flat, with a mark on it she had made herself. She had carried it for 6 years. "I made this," she said, "when I found out you still had the garden." He looked at the small iron piece. "How did you find out?" "Checked records. Property records. You maintain the estate. You kept the garden on the maintenance schedules." "Property records," he said. "Don't be flattered," she said. "It was incidental intelligence." It was absolutely not incidental. The almost smile. The full version again. "No," she said softly. "It wasn't." He reached out and, very carefully, turned the small iron piece over in his palm. "You made this with your hands. Don't make it strange," she said. Something enormous moved across his face. Then he laughed, a real, low, sudden laugh that she had not heard since they were 16, and she stared at him because it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in 9 years, and she was not prepared for it. "What?" she said, though she already knew. "Nothing," he said, still with the residue of the laugh in his voice. "It's just," he looked at her. "We are exactly the same idiots we were in that garden." She looked at him. Then she started laughing too. Both of them, by the firelight, laughing, the specific laughter of people who have been very serious and very alone for a very long time and have just remembered that they don't have to be anymore. Toward the early hours of the morning, Kingston's cleared networks had begun sending in reports. The evidence Talia's team had delivered was already moving through the right channels. Allies who had publicly distanced themselves were making quiet inquiries. The machinery of restoration was beginning to turn. There would be weeks of work ahead. Public appearances, careful navigation, the rebuilding of structures that had been eroded over years. It would not be simple. Kingston knew this clearly, and without self-pity. He had built things before, and he knew the shape of the work. But he would not be doing it alone. This was the change. This was the fundamental, tectonic change that everything else organized around. He said it to her plainly, because they were past the time for indirection. "I want you beside me in this. Not just through the immediate, through what comes after." She looked at him steadily. "As what?" "As whatever you are," he said. "Which is, for the record, the person who is most capable in any room I have ever been in." "That's a strategic argument," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I also just want you here. Both things are true." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll need my team accommodated." "Done. And I will not be managed. I know better than to try. And I will continue to tell you when you're wrong. I would be concerned if you didn't." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. Same word. Same answer as in the rain. He reached out across the space between them, not the urgent reach of the garden, but something quieter and more certain, and pushed her hair back from her face. She let him. The bracelets were on the table between them. Both of them, his finally returned to his wrist, hers still on hers where it had always been. Same cord. Same clasp. Different wear patterns. Hers worn consistently, his worn in the hand rather than on the wrist, but worn just as much. The elders had written about this in their records before either of them could read. Some bonds were written before the people who carry them were born. Some gardens were planted for 2 specific people who hadn't arrived yet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city was quiet. Something vast had returned to its correct position. Chapter 13: The Alpha and His Equal. 3 weeks later. The restoration of Kingston's name was not a single event, but a sequence, documented, evidenced, methodical in the way that Talia had constructed everything, designed so that each piece corroborated the next, and the whole could not be questioned without questioning a chain of verifiable fact. It took 11 days to make it irrefutable and another week to make it public. Kingston managed the public dimension with a particular steady calm that had always been his. Not crowing, not vindicated aggressive, just factual and forward-moving. He did not perform relief. He returned to work. Dane, Maddox, and Stern were handled by the relevant authorities. Kingston appeared at exactly the number of proceedings required and said exactly as much as was necessary. Not a word more. His allies returned, the ones who had genuinely been misled, which was most of them. A few who had chosen the other side with full information were not welcomed back. He was clear and non-punitive about this. Simply, precisely clear. That door is closed. The clarity of it was, for many watching, its own kind of power. They were extraordinary together. People who worked around them first noticed it as efficiency. Meetings ran better when both of them were in the room. Decisions were sharper. Problems that had been circular for weeks resolved when the two of them sat down with them. Then people started to notice the specific quality of the collaboration. The way Kingston's broader force and Talia's strategic precision complemented each other so completely that it was difficult to identify where one ended and the other began. The way they argued, directly without performance, and then landed somewhere better than either starting point. Then people noticed the other thing. The way he tracked her in a room with a quality of attention that was unlike anything else in his usually controlled manner. The way she angled herself almost imperceptibly toward him in group settings. The way the leather cord bracelet on each of their wrists had become the thing that new people asked about, and old people had learned not to ask about, because the answer required more context than a corridor conversation could contain. The garden was tended. This was their ritual, the one private thing they kept entirely their own, regardless of how public everything else became. Sunday mornings, when the estate was quiet and the city had not yet fully woken. The garden. The oak tree.
Sometimes they talked.
Sometimes they read. She had her book. He had learned to actually sit still beside her without it, which had taken him since the age of 11 to accomplish. Sometimes they simply stood in it. It had been replanted at the edges. New things added to the ivy. The stone path cleared and relaid. Small light fixtures added to the walls for evenings. But the center of it was untouched. The oak tree exactly as it had always been. The stone wall. The iron gate in the far corner through which an 11-year-old had once stepped and found his entire life rearranged. On a Sunday in late spring, the garden full, the oak tree in full leaf, the city beyond the stone walls alive with morning, Kingston stood up from the base of the tree and held out his hand. Talia looked up from her book. He said nothing, just his hand, extended, the leather cord bracelet on his wrist.
She looked at the hand.
Then up at his face, the jaw, the scar, the dark amber eyes open and certain, and exactly the same age they had always been in this garden, which was 11 and forever simultaneously. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. They stood face to face under the full-leafed oak tree, in the light, with the garden around them and the bracelets on their wrists and 9 years compressed into a single point that had finally resolved.
He did not let go.
She did not let go. He looked at her for a long moment in the light. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I have been thinking about standing here with you since I was 11 years old," he said, "and that it is better than I thought it would be, which I did not think was possible." She was quiet. The almost smile, fully arrived, fully real, the one she had been holding back since the garden in the rain. "Kingston," she said. "Yes." "Shut up," she said warmly. "And just stand here."
He did.
They stood there together under the oak tree in their garden in the light. The city moved around them. The world continued its mourning. Everything that had been conspired against, taken apart, separated, grieved, rebuilt, all of it had led precisely here, to two people, one garden, and a hand held without letting go. Some bonds were written before the people who carry them were born. Some gardens were planted for two people who hadn't arrived yet. They arrived. And that is where we leave Kingston and Talia. This story moved something in you. If you felt every stolen glance, every year of waiting, every moment in that rain-soaked garden, then you already know this isn't the kind of story you forget easily. And it isn't where it ends. There are more stories waiting for you. More worlds like this one. More love written in blood and time. More characters who will make you feel everything you just felt, and then some. They're all on my channel. So if you haven't already, subscribe. Hit that notification bell, because the next story is coming and you do not want to miss it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.